I don't know if there is another individual who I have been so fascinated with my entire life than Aleister Crowley. I remember somewhat vividly the very first time that I read his name, and it was in I think at least one or two of the books. They're called Mysteries of the Unknown, which were put out by Time Warner. I think many of you would probably recognize these books. They were black. They had silver writing on them. They had like a small square picture on the covers of the books. But anyways, I forget which one of these books it was, but I opened it and it talked about this figure by the name of Aleister Crowley, and that he was the wickedest man in the world. And there was a picture of somebody wearing a hooded robe with a finger up to his mouth like he's making a shh gesture. And then a little bit later on, I believe there was a picture of him. I think we all know this picture. It's he's pointing at something, but his finger is crooked, and he's a very old man. But I believe I was in grade 5, so I was somewhat young when this occurred, and he immediately fascinated me. But it just kind of went away. But Aleister Crowley kept popping up in my life almost like a bad penny. I would read books by Colin Wilson, and of course, Colin Wilson was obsessed with Aleister Crowley. Maybe not obsessed. Anyways, he would talk about Aleister Crowley. When I was in grade 9, a friend of mine bought the Simonomicon, or the Necronomicon, and Aleister Crowley was brought up in that. There's a book called The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry. I believe Aleister Crowley was brought up in that. And he was always kind of around and in the periphery. But it wasn't until I read Robert Anton Wilson's Cosmic Trigger that I was like, oh, okay, I guess I need to see more about this Aleister Crowley character and start to take him a bit more seriously. And so I got out of the Edmonton Public Library, I got out a book called Portable Darkness, which had an introduction by Robert Anton Wilson, and I would read through about Aleister Crowley and his rituals. And truth be told, I did not know what the hell was going on with this Aleister Crowley guy. The reason that I bring up a bit of this nostalgia for Aleister Crowley in my life is to, in a way, let people know that Aleister Crowley has been a figure that has been with me for a very long period of time. So I hope you will join me in going through a few of my beastly thoughts of Aleister Crowley. My name is Douglas Batchelor, and this is What Magic Is This? A podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird. I don't think that there is a worse introduction to try and get Crowley off on the right foot than Robert Anton Wilson and Timothy Leary. I think that the things that they said about Aleister Crowley are very starry-eyed, and at points it makes me wonder whether or not they even read Aleister Crowley, because they get a lot wrong. It's part of me that's like, think, are those guys on drugs or something? Because they really don't know what they're talking about. But of course, in retrospect, one can say this kind of thing. But I approached Aleister Crowley very much starry-eyed. And when I first started doing magic, I, of course, started off as a bit of a chaos magician, then gradually drifted into doing Thelema and Golden Dawn rituals. And I say this with zero shame whatsoever. I called myself a Thelemite for 7-8 years of my life. I considered myself a Thelemite. I did the magic of Aleister Crowley. I had the books. I do the rituals. I tried to get all of the gear and whatnot. I'm not going to blame Aleister Crowley for such things, but I did think, like the more substances I take, the better my magic will be, and which is a really shitty reading of Aleister Crowley. I'm going to be talking a bit about Aleister Crowley in this episode as if you, the listener, know a little bit about Aleister Crowley. Hopefully, if you listened to my 2 previous episodes before jumping into this one, and hopefully you have a little bit of a cursory knowledge of the legend and the life story of Aleister Crowley and what Thelema means. If not, you're going to be woefully lost on this episode. Suffice to say, called myself a Thelemite, and at points I even I've told many people, many friends, I said, I think that Aleister Crowley is the greatest magician who has ever lived. And there's a lot of people that do really think this. I do not think such things anymore. So in any case, this episode will be me going through a few of my thoughts about Aleister Crowley and Thelema and his magic. So please keep in mind that this is one man's opinion. It's one person's opinion, somebody who was a former Thelemite. At parts, this episode is going to be very, very ranty, rant-based, and hopefully some of the things that I'm saying register. But I really don't want people thinking that I'm trying to turn freighters into haters. I'm not. I just wanted to get this off my chest because people are curious as to my thoughts of Aleister Crowley. As I said, I put out a couple of episodes where I talk down on the guy and his magic. So here it is, getting it out into the open, and hopefully I'm not going to get people emailing me, asking me what my thoughts are on Aleister Crowley, because I will be able to point them to this episode. Special thanks to Dan Lowe for the freighters into haters joke. That's a really good one. But yes, 7 years I called myself a Thelemite. I would do Liber Resh as much as possible. I would go through some of the rituals that I would find from any place I could find the rituals, either online, or sometimes I would be able to take out library books or maybe even order books. Crowley was my jam, and I tried to do as much Crowley-oriented magic as possible. And then I decided that I wanted to learn more about the person that was writing these rituals, because I found that a lot of the things that he would write in things like Magic Without Tears would contradict things that he would say earlier. And so I wanted to know about this man. So I started to read a lot of biographies. The very first biography that I read was The Eye in the Triangle by Israel Regardie, which has an interesting take of Aleister Crowley. But then I just started to find as many biographies of Crowley as I could. Of course, there's the John Simons biography. There was the Lawrence Sutin biography. I even got a hold of Colin Wilson, who I love and I adore. I was able to get a hold of his biography of Aleister Crowley. And a lot of what Colin said really makes sense. So I started to form an opinion of the man who was crafting these rituals, the rituals from which I took my magic, from where I would say I took my magical power. And the more I read, the less I enjoyed it. My picture of Crowley is one that is shared by quite a few people. Now, I think that Aleister Crowley is or was a deeply, deeply troubled individual and very troublesome. He was very good at writing sometimes. He wrote a lot. Some of the things he says make very good sense. The man understood how to compose a ritual like no other. He understood the components. But I think they sprung forth from an individual who was petty and more often than not, very mean-spirited. My knowledge of Crowley and what kind of a person he was that came from these biographies started to taint the magic that I was doing. It almost seemed like I was just going through the motions to try and do Thelemic magic and Thelemic rituals. In most cases, my magic looked more like that from Stephen Mace's Stealing the Fire from Heaven, which is chaos magic, but heavily influenced by both Austin Osman Spare and Aleister Crowley. But as I kept going, and reading more about Crowley and doing more of his rituals, something started to change. I started to feel a bit more resigned, and in some cases, a little bit icky doing these things. But I would just tell myself, this is part of the new Aeon. It's the birth pains of the new Aeon. But don't worry, it'll all be okay. I truly believed these things. I truly bought all of Crowley's cosmology, his mythology, whatever you want to call it. I bought his story, hook, line, and sinker, and it became the foundation for all of my magic. And yet these days, not unlike a lot of magicians that I look up to, Crowley plays absolutely zero part in my life. And any and all of his rituals are gone. It's like Crowley never even existed in my magic. For many, they say, just the foundation of Thelema and the Hermetic Kabbalah and whatnot is enough. Just strip it of the pageantry of Aleister Crowley, and that's a great foundation to go on. And I would agree with this, but for me, it didn't go far enough. I don't think Crowley's descriptions as to how magic works is sufficient. And I think a lot of it is given to Crowley that he is a bigger genius than he actually was. As mentioned in my last episode, I think more people need to read into the relationship between Samuel Little MacGregor Mathers and Aleister Crowley. With the understandings that I have now and all of the biographies I've read, the picture that appears is that every major thing that we attribute to Crowley before the age of 50 is in some sense an act of either wanting to be MacGregor Mathers or to get revenge on him in some way. Crowley was in some way in love with MacGregor Mathers. I always think of This Is Spinal Tap for some strange reason when I think of Mathers and Crowley, and particularly the characters of David and Nigel, and just in the way that Nigel is always staring at David and is deeply in love with this man. He just cannot show that he's in love with the character of David St. Hubbins. I think that is almost in a way the relationship that Crowley had with Mathers. He looked up to MacGregor Mathers, and anytime that MacGregor Mathers did anything that Crowley didn't approve of, he became a vicious character. He became very petty, and he became very vile in some way, to the point of taking the works of Mathers and publishing them under his name, including curses to Mathers in these works. He would sign letters as Aleister MacGregor. Yeah, it's one of those areas that I think warrants a lot more investigation. The magic of Aleister Crowley, for the most part, is ripped wholesale from another man, with a cosmology from a magical order, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, that MacGregor Mathers was one of the founding members of and the driving force of. So in that way, Crowley is not as original as many make him out to be. And I get it, and that is fairly human to be so crushed by somebody that you look up to that in some way it motivates you to do things. But instead of taking the high road, Crowley decided to tap into his most base instincts, which was to become a very petty individual and to take out a lot of his anger on other people, as well as to create a mythology like the Book of the Law, which to me reads as somebody wanting to create something better than the person who has just recently shunned them. Aleister Crowley is quoted as saying that I must find a material in which to work which is immune from the forces of change. He had Ozymandian instincts unlike any other person. He wanted to be remembered, but he knew that he wasn't as good enough of a poet or a painter or any other thing that he set his hand to. But that magic was his ticket to ride into infamy. And hats off to him for realizing this, because we're still talking about this guy more than a century later. But to have fairly acute Ozymandian instincts does not a great magician make. While I do agree with some biographers that want to make Crowley into a bit more of a human character, and we do realize that a lot of the things he did and a lot of the decisions that he made, and even how he was with his family when he had a family, are fairly human. But I think we have to be careful with saying that Aleister Crowley is just like us. He had very extreme circumstances to his life, and I'm going to put my foot down and basically say, no, Crowley is not like the vast majority of us. While I won't go as far as saying that he would be a sociopath or a psychopath, I do believe he exhibits traits that mark him to be somebody who would be deeply unpleasant at the best of times. Aleister Crowley would never be on your side. Not unless you were fucking him or giving him money. His story is not one of somebody who, as they move through life, exhibit traits that each and every one of us can sympathize with. His is an exceptional story about an exceptional person who did exceptional things, both positive and negative. And that was by design. And Crowley thankfully realized just what kind of an individual was and decided he wasn't going to change that. Whether we should applaud this or despair for this is entirely subjective and up to you. Most people that I know these days who are Thelemites have ridded themselves of the shadow that hangs over Aleister Crowley's Thelema. They have gotten rid of Crowley, but stick with the rituals. And I don't have too much to comment on as far as this is concerned, except to say I don't really know how that works. I've said before that I think that Aleister Crowley and Thelema is a bit of a cul-de-sac, and I do stand by that. You can only go so far into investigating the rituals and the magic of Aleister Crowley before it becomes a dead end, and you endlessly just find yourself circling around with the things that Crowley said, his contradictions, and each and every time that he has contradicted himself, the endless debate as to what Crowley actually said is more frustrating than it is helpful, which is why I think we see a resurgence of interest in figures who took Thelema a little bit further, people like Jack Parsons or Kenneth Grant, because at base, Crowley really didn't have very much magic. I also see a lot of people using the figures that Crowley talks about, Baphomet or Babylon, the whore of Revelation, which is all well and good, but contained within Crowley himself and his Thelema is not that much. It's actually quite slight, and it exists to me as a cul-de-sac, which in a way I think explains why a lot of people will call themselves Thelemites, but a lot of their magic isn't so Thelemic. It exists as the framework of Hermetic Kabbalah, and kind of the book of the law being as close to like some kind of a scripture as possible, but the magic that they engage in is less Crowley's magic and more so the magic of other people. Thelema becomes a coat hook as opposed to the jacket that one wears when they want to do magic. I don't want to put too fine a point on it because one could make a lot of the fact that Aleister Crowley thinks that magic is the magician's will. Doing one's will. Will is a fairly loaded word, and also I don't think a lot of people, when they talk about will, are keeping up to date with current thoughts as far as if indeed we do have will. Now, This can be a whole series of episodes, but truthfully, I find the discussion as to whether or not the fates are determined to be not that interesting, but it's interesting to sit with the idea of perhaps all time has already happened and we are slowly being pulled by strings in which we are intuiting the future at every step, a la something like the Minkowski block universe, which has been touted by Time Loop Alert, Eric Wargo as well. It's interesting to think about. But this idea of you doing your will is the most important aspect of magic. Now, this was fairly attractive to me when I first started with Thelema. I think that this idea of freedom, and everything is as I want it to be. All my magic is because of my will and whatnot. And as I've aged, I've realized that something like agency, which is very important, agency and interiority, which are very, very important, are not the entire picture. And to say that magic is the art and science that provokes change in conformity with the will, for some people, that can be very powerful, very freeing, and for other people, it turns them into giant assholes. I ask each and every person that wishes to engage in Thelema or call themselves a Thelemite to really sit on this idea of will and what will is, and perhaps to even look into the idea that perhaps will isn't actually a thing. Thelemites will be the first to tell you that when Aleister Crowley says, "Do as thou wilt," it does not mean just do whatever you want. But in a way, it kind of does, which is unfortunate. Most people's conceptions of the will are at worst childish and at best merely adolescent. The amount of unicursal hexagrams that I see from individuals who frankly scare me and who appear somewhat regularly out of the blue, championing a cause that is less than desirable, is somewhat startling. I hope that a lot of this doesn't sound like I'm judging, merely observing. I understand the appeal of Thelema. I understand the appeal of do as thou wilt. I know that many people have said that Thelema predates Crowley. I haven't seen too convincing of an argument in this case, but even if the idea of Rabelaisian humanism is how we want to define Thelema, then the appeal is a really interesting one. Can each and every person who thinks that they are doing their will be a positive source for change within the world? It's a question that one can sit with. I do not think that it is the best one, as it puts perhaps too much onus on the individual, which is cool. I get it. I think there needs to be something else outside, which is why I will gravitate a bit more towards an individual, say like Emanuel Swedenborg, who, if he has a do as thou wilt, would be something like do the good that you know, which, of course, the same subjectivity question can enter into that one as, well, what is good? But I think that at this point, many of us are merely splitting hairs when we try to talk about will and all of us doing our will and how that can be a force for change for good within the world. I mean, there's always going to be people who take it a bit too far. It's unfortunate that the person that came up with this idea was one of them. As pointed out in the previous two Aleister Crowley episodes, there really isn't that much magic in Thelema and from Aleister Crowley. There's not really a Thelemic magic per se. What you do have, though, and something that a lot of people find very helpful, is this framework, this Hermetic Kabbalah framework, as well as the mythos that surrounds Thelema, the Book of the Law, Babylon, and many more, which can be quite helpful for people, I think. There are a lot of people that call themselves Thelemites that I look up to, but a lot of them are not doing the magic of Aleister Crowley. They are doing something else, but using the framework that Crowley put up. They've stripped the pageantry of Aleister Crowley and his rituals and a lot of the story of Aleister, the things that he believed himself, or at least we suppose that he believed, and doing something very new with it. And this is very admirable, I believe. For myself, I really dislike the Hermetic Kabbalistic framework in which each thing has its own compartment, and there's correspondences, and yada blah blah blah. I think that this limits things more than it allows things to express themselves. The world is always in a dance of becoming, and I think that each thing is an expression of its interiority. And while we can say that correspondences show that there is an inherent language to this living universe we find ourselves in, the A to B Lego blocking of how we view the Hermetic Kabbalah correspondences doesn't do anything for me. It diminishes as opposed to enlightens. And this could just be down to the individual. I know some people like to have a complete framework in which to do magic, and that is all well and good. But for myself and a lot of the magicians that I look up to, it falls short. They need something more. There was a really interesting observation made by somebody in the Discord server, actually, which was very funny, in regards to Aleister Crowley not really having a form of tangible Thelemic magic. And it was that Aleister Crowley, while he was alive, actually got angry at people when they attempted to make their own Thelemic magic. People like Jack Parsons, who, with his Babylon working, Aleister Crowley was basically slagging off these people to his friends. Like, they don't know what they're doing. They're idiots. So the people that were literally trying to craft their own magic, Aleister Crowley thought that these people were idiots. And that's very, very funny to me, as well as being a very astute observation. But I think that in this, I can see the attraction of Aleister Crowley, because there are these things like Babylon and Enochian that Aleister Crowley bumps up against, which are very interesting. And if you do not have the Hermetic Kabbalah framework, and you do not buy everything that Aleister Crowley is promulgating, you are left with some very clear myths. And myths are indeed incredibly important. Aleister Crowley's Egypt, Hermeticism, Rosicrucian, weird stuff that is the cosmology of Thelema is a bit of a mess. It's not exactly historically accurate, but that's cool. Myths are indeed cool. And for a lot of people, they almost consider Aleister Crowley and his magic a myth in and of itself, which in some instances I believe are very helpful. And it is certainly a way to work around the lack of magic with Aleister Crowley and Thelema. And especially these days when more and more indicators that the reception of the book and the law may in fact be a complete fabrication done years after the fact. It does not make the story or the words that are in the book of the law any less important, but the realization that the way in which Crowley presented the book of the law is in fact a myth. Myths are great. They're wonderful. We're in magic. This is why we're here. And yet, we need to realize that myth should not be taken as factual history. They should be taken as inspiration to make your magic better so that you yourself become part of history. You add to the wonderful story and myth of magic itself with your deeds. You push things forward. As it stands, Crowley is the result of this wonderfully subtle hijack that the Golden Dawn did in which they smushed magic and mysticism together, two things which, for the most part, through the most of history, were entirely separate. And now, after the Golden Dawn, but more specifically with Aleister Crowley, they were put together and they cannot be separated. So one has to wonder if doing things as Crowley has written actually makes you a magician. Now, of course, this can be construed as being gatekeeping, like, Douglas, you gatekeeper, son of a bitch, you, what's going on here? But I think most people that are Thelemites now would probably tend to agree that what they do is more mystical than practical magic. And I think for the most part, it also becomes a bit more philosophical. Thelemites love talking about occult philosophy, which is wonderful, which is great. And occult philosophy is indeed a thing, although I am not too much of a fan of it. I think that by engaging in this mystical Thelema enterprise, in some way, a lot of people that call themselves Thelemites are continuing to tap into that part of themselves that maybe they missed or maybe they wish to continue, of being in Philosophy 101 classes once they get out of high school. Aleister Crowley wrote a ton, and there are so many things you can pick through in his books. There's so many contradictions within his books. He just wrote so much that I think that a lot of people give him far more credit than what is warranted. I will say this, though. Aleister Crowley did do quite a bit of work, or at least it appears that Aleister Crowley did a lot of the things in which he promulgated. He was also the master of do as I say, not as I do, which for somebody who wrote do as thou wilt is a bit of a conundrum, but contradictions come thick and fast when one takes up the Thelemic mantle. For myself, I think that mysticism and magic, there's a lot that they share. I try not to separate them too much, and I know a lot of people that it is their ambition through their personal praxis to showcase mysticism through magical acts, and that is all well and good. Yet the somewhat obvious lack of a pointed magic within Thelema might very well be its downfall, as seemingly most of the magic that people would want to engage with exists outside of a Thelemic framework. And so is being a Thelemite these days merely paying lip service to an idea like do it thou wilt? Is it merely just Orientalism and funny hats? Is it just a better living through waving your hands in the air? Is it going over the copious works of a man who was high quite a lot of his life and debating with others as to what you think it means? Are these the things a Thelemite make? For myself, this was one of the major reasons that I called Thelema and Golden Dawn gift shop magic. It didn't really seem like I was engaging with anything useful. It seemed to be a bit more mystical and mythological than historical and practical, which, for some people, is exactly what they want. For myself, I needed a bit more. One of the things that is endlessly debated on the internet or in occult forums is the idea of an Aeon, which is not exclusive to Aleister Crowley, of course, but it is a very loudly debated topic. And this idea that we are entering into a new Aeon of humanity. They will say, look at what's happened over the last 150 years. My goodness, let's all look at what's going on. Can't we see that something is changing? The revelation is at hand. And even if this exists as merely a model or in some way somewhat of a thought experiment for most people, to somebody like me who is a student of history, It almost seemed like anybody who was mystical that lived through the tail end of the 19th century said that there was going to be a new Aeon, and a lot of it was very sexual in nature. A lot of it is very war-based. This is more indicative of the times than anything else. For myself, I don't see history as a straight line. Things seem to go in circles more so than anything, but this is not the episode in which to discuss such things. All I can say is that the 19th century, particularly the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, was an exceptional period of human history, particularly in the West. Changes were coming thick and fast in every regard. There's another individual who was born the same year as Aleister Crowley, who also saw a new age born, a gentleman by the name of Carl Gustav Jung. That's right. Carl Jung was born in 1875, the same year as Aleister Crowley. He himself has a new Aeon, just like Aleister Crowley. In fact, Jung wrote about it in a book called Aeon. Without going into too much detail, for Jung, it involved the constellation Pisces, it involved fish, it involves Jesus Christ, it involves the end of spirituality and a more materialistic way of viewing the future, and on and on. And while I will not make too much of a comparison with how Aleister Crowley saw his new Aeon and how Carl Jung saw his new Aeon, I merely bring this up to illustrate the fact that well-to-do, mystical people seem to have had a vocation of trying to look into the future and to try and pronounce that a revelation was due. For myself, I don't see this as overly helpful. I do think that perhaps something more akin to Charles Fort's dominance is in play, but have a listen to my Charles Fort episode, more on that. I believe this revelation will be more epistemological than apocalyptic. I guess through all of this, what I'm trying to say is applying a bit more context to the time and the circumstances of where these ideas come from is always one of those things that I will support and I will champion, especially when you're dealing with an individual like Aleister Crowley. And I think that this is somewhat important for any kind of magic, particularly those that are more popular. It doesn't mean that if you have to tear your idols down. It just means that you have to dig a little bit deeper. Do the work. It's what a lot of these people would have told you anyways. It is always good to sit with the ideas that make up the frameworks of what you were trying to get out of magic and why you were doing magic in the first place. If you are looking to Thelema to get away from the old rigmarole of one of the major Abrahamic religions, I hate to say it, but the crucible by which Aleister Crowley arrived at his brand of a new religious movement are almost exactly the same. This idea that Aleister Crowley hated religion is not a real one. Aleister Crowley wanted his own, and he wanted you to go along with it. And if you had money to give him, even better. The song remains the same with religion. And while the ideas within Thelema may look very different than, say, that of Christianity, how it was arrived at is strikingly similar. Keep this in mind if you choose to proceed. It might also be worth asking yourself, how does the idea of myth play into your magic? Particularly if you think that something like the Book of the Law and how Crowley says it was arrived at isn't true. It is very easy for people to basically say that I want to distance my Thelema from Aleister Crowley, but there is a lot that is baked in to Thelema on purpose. Might I also suggest looking at other figures that have started their own religions? People like Joseph Smith or L. Ron Hubbard. Figures that a lot of Thelemites would poo-poo. They share more of a similarity with Crowley than many would like to think. As time progresses, Aleister Crowley appears to be more and more of a con artist than a truly enlightened individual. He wanted people to see his genius, and he is dismayed when people don't. And he also acts out and punishes others who fail to see his brilliance. Through all of this, the story remains the same. I have this joke that goes like this. The only difference between L. Ron Hubbard and Aleister Crowley is that L. Ron Hubbard had more sex. That really bothers people. There might be something else to think about in here as well. One of my favorite books about Aleister Crowley is Secret Agent 666, which to me has a very persuasive argument that Aleister Crowley might have been more of a spy than most people think, and might have started very early in and around the Golden Dawn era, and that Aleister Crowley very well might have been an op. What changes for you in this man's idea if a lot of what he wrote was in some way a smokescreen for him being a secret agent? I don't want to reveal too much of this, but reading that book is a bit of a mind fuck. But it is also important to sit with. What if Aleister Crowley was just a spy? A spy who might have liked to write rituals and do some crazy stuff. Aleister Crowley is in some very interesting places at very interesting periods of time. And even if this exists as a thought experiment for you, it's a very fun one. When Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of England for the second time, it is well known that he burned or had destroyed a lot of files on people that he used as spies. And this occurred in the early 50s. How much of Aleister Crowley's shenanigans were espionage is perhaps lost to time. But it is a very fun one, thinking that Aleister Crowley, from top to bottom, was an op. And that many people over the last 80 years have been engaging in the offerings of a poor man's weirdo James Bond. Most likely this isn't the case due to the amount of writings that Aleister Crowley left behind, but nevertheless, still pretty fun. Almost more fun than actually going through the works themselves. I talk down a lot about Aleister Crowley, but there are some bright spots. There are some things that are indeed good and that have been happening over the last little while. As mentioned earlier, I think that there are a lot of people that call themselves Thelemites that are doing some very great work within contemporary magic. None more so than Peter and Alkistis from Scarlet Imprint Publishing. I love reading their introspections and their ideas about Aleister Crowley and Thelema. It's still, I think, very, very pertinent work. Somebody did ask if there was a way of consolidating the idea that Aleister Crowley was this wonderful individual who gave a ton to magic, and this other thought that he was this really horrible man, this monster of humanity who had a revelation that he didn't understand and couldn't share with the world except to dress it up in Rosicrucian Egypto-Hermetic clothing. The closest that we have right now is the work of Scarlet Imprint. And I say this with the utmost love that Scarlet Imprint is the sonorous death rattle of Thelema, particularly through the chapter in Peter Gray's The Red Goddess called Rhymes with Holy, which is about Aleister Crowley and Babylon. Indeed, these days, Babylon seems to be the way forward. People are ditching a lot of the older notions and figures within Thelema and adopting that of Babylon. But that's a whole other episode unto itself. Peter and Alcestis are devotional to Babylon, and the way in which their magic revolves around Babylon is breathtaking. It is really quite wonderful, and I will read anything that they have to say about Babylon and Thelema. It is a joy to behold, and this is a very healthy way of dealing with the works of Aleister Crowley. I think that Peter Shoemaker, with a book called Living Thelema, is a very interesting way of trying to incorporate the Thelemic framework as well as Hermetic Kabbalah into one's life to almost have a regiment, both with meditation and journeying and thought experiments that you can envelop in your life to allow yourself to become a better person. I think that that's truly one of the more wonderful gifts that has occurred within Thelema in the last little while. Good work is still being done in the name of Thelema. It is more individual-oriented, but of course with something like Thelema, that's just how it's going to go. You can find them. They are out there. And what is most excellent about it is that Aleister Crowley probably would have hated it, which is fantastic. Some of my favorite figures promulgating Thelema are women and transgender and non-binary figures. I have often wondered whether or not the greatest magic that Crowley ever did was somehow baking misogyny into the ideas of Thelema. For a new religious movement that seems to purport to be about individualized freedom, there seemed to be a whole lot of misogyny involved. And Crowley himself did not have a very positive view of women. He said they were okay, but he also thought that they were to be receivers of the male sexual power for the most part. Reminds me of something that I saw in the What Magic Is This Discord. Thelema, great women, questionable men, for the most part, at least. So it's no wonder that a lot of people are going towards this idea of the deity Babylon, the mother of all abominations. I love this stuff, and I think it's very important, especially nowadays, as I can recall in the last 15 years there being quite a bit of questionable bullshit happening within Thelema, and particularly amongst the ideas of sexual polarity. And while Crowley is given a lot of credit for his ideas of sexual polarity, I think in a lot of cases, people take his ideas and ascribe to him some kind of credit where it is, for the most part, undue. Indeed, we are seeing some very interesting fruit falling from this dying tree. It is this fruit that will see the continuance of Thelema, as opposed to the old orthodox change not one letter, blah-de-blah-de-blah. It will also be in the benefit of Thelema, perhaps, to stop promulgating just how scientific magic is. Yes, magic can have a scientific method to it. Of course, having a magical journal and looking and seeing what works and what doesn't is also very good. But I would suggest reading Alan Moore's Fossil Angels, in which he makes a very good case that magic is not science, nor should it be construed as being scientific. Indeed, I would agree that this is something that not only Thelema, but magic has to get away from a little bit. I am tired of getting emails of people asking me the mechanics of magic. Magic doesn't have any mechanics. And thinking of it mechanistically does nobody any favors. I hope that registers with people, because I am not saying not to test things and see what works and see what doesn't. But by saying magic is inherently scientific has quite a few pitfalls. Magic should not be looked at as a fully realized synthetic doctrine, nor should it be seen as an ideal objective science in any shape or form. You diminish the wonderful tradition of magic by thinking so. This actually goes to something that Dr. Rain Mason said in a tweet once, which I absolutely love it. And I love this idea of thinking of the Western occult and esoteric tradition as a river, a wonderful river in which has many tributaries that all kind of flow into each other, and they generate competing currents and eddies, but they all look like they are flowing in one stream, right? Something that I think is important to realize, particularly for people that begin in magic, because a lot of the books that are available to people in bookstores seem to be of the opinion that the history of magic and the way that magic is practiced in the West is the cosmology and metaphysics, and even the history that is promulgated by the Golden Dawn and by Thelema. And this actually makes me somewhat angry. Of all the things I want to try and get people away from is this somewhat spurious history of magic. So people need to realize that the Western occult and esoteric tradition does not belong to any one group. It does not particularly belong to Aleister Crowley and what he says, as well as this idea of the new Aeon. That is a model. That is a model that is useful to Thelema and nothing else. I don't think it's relatively useful to magic in general, nor should everybody who starts doing magic have to do lesser banishing rituals of the pentagram or accept that Rahor Quit is the child of the new Aeon or some bullshit like that. Again, that is specific to one man's cosmology. That is not the framework of the entire Western esoteric tradition. Confusing this mythology and metaphysical framework for the actual history and worldview of Western magic is incredibly harmful. And that's something that I think not a lot of people are going to tell you right out the gate. For the most part, most of the occult books are controlled by a few publishers that make a lot of money off of selling this worldview, this Thelemic worldview. And that's another thing about Aleister Crowley, is that he brings in a ton of money. He's that boogeyman that everybody loves, that cut-up character, that lovable rogue that people love to throw money at. And they have for well over 50 years. The one sound I've always equated with Thelema is that of a cash register going off consistently. So if you're beginning in magic and nobody has told you that, guess what, this new Aeon or Hermetic Kabbalah is the fundamental underpinnings of Western magic, no, it's not. I'm telling you, it's not. It is available to those who wish to have it be so, but my magic has nothing to do with any of this stuff, nor is it the framework and the magic of those who I admire. Most of them are acquainted with Crowley and have moved on, just like myself. So what can I say about the whole enterprise, just to put a bow on the month of the beast? Well, I think that Peter Gray is very correct in his assessment that many who read Crowley became faded photocopies of him rather than lived their own lives. Is Aleister Crowley one of the most important figures in all of Western magic? As the years roll by, I believe his influence is waning more and more as the years pass. We can see that he wasn't as imaginative as perhaps many of us have made him out to be. The details of his life and how he treated other people is definitely not doing him any favors as we become more progressive in our ideals. And the idea of removing him for his ideas might actually be more of a death knell to Thelema than something that is going to resuscitate a dying tradition. And yet this is not new. Just as I said that the story of Thelema is the story of other religions, this is also how new religious movements slowly fade away. Just like that of the religious movement that Crowley was born into, the Plymouth Brethren. It's just how it goes, inevitably. How ironic should it be? Every few years, another occult figure will rise up and put a defibrillator to the emaciated body that is Thelema or Aleister Crowley, and people will get interested in it all over again. And then the inevitable occurs, and people just lose interest once more. The hits never stop coming. What if Thelema and quantum physics was a thing? What if Thelema and string theory is a thing, etc., etc.? Add the flavor of the month. Everybody puts a book out, and a lot of people make money. In a way, Thelema has become the sideshow geek. Bring him out once again for old time's sake. So was Aleister Crowley as much of an influence as we should say? I think he was a necessary step, albeit in a lot of ways a step backwards. To me, Crowley is an overemphasized footnote in the story of the Western occult tradition. A man whose hits were born out of pettiness, lying, and deceit, whose most notable works are unimaginative myths or stolen from worthier people. To me, Crowley and Thelema will be the U2 of Western magic. Bombastic, facile, and very of its time, and in a few decades we will wonder why it was ever a thing. And for those who are new to magic and wondering if they should take the plunge, I'm not sure if you need to know about Aleister Crowley before you begin. I would suggest avoiding him at the outset. Circle back in a couple of years, perhaps, just to have a look. You can literally spend a month going over Aleister Crowley, and you're good. Uri Geller has done more for magic than Aleister Crowley has. Controversial, but true. But I'm here to tell you right now that Thelema is just another flavor of magic. It's just another thing to explore. Do not buy into the fact that others will try and convince you that it is the river itself. It is not. It is merely one of the tributaries. It is one that people will swear is the most important, but it is not. Do not confuse the stream for the river. And always, always beware of poets who rhyme religion with pigeon. So that's the show, everybody. I hope that this was enjoyable in some way. Who knows? You never know. You might have liked some of the things I said. I don't think that irreverence is entirely my brand. It's not really what I'm going for, but some of you asked, what's my opinion? And this was it. So there'll be some show notes put up at whatmagicisthis.com. Please be sure to check them out. There'll be some interesting stuff there. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you will find links to my Twitter account, my Instagram account, as well as my Facebook account. I am not on Facebook or Instagram that much. I'm trying to be a little bit more, but I'm fairly active on Twitter. Head there. I try to put up some interesting stuff on the old timeline. Try to keep it somewhat positive for the most part, because Twitter is a cesspool of negativity, and we don't need any more of that stuff there. If you enjoy the show, please tell a friend. Tell a friend, and maybe they'll tell a friend, and then they'll tell a friend. And that's how this whole word of mouth thing gets going. I don't do a ton of my own marketing. I rely on the word of mouth. And that is the best part. So if you like the show, tell a friend. Also, if you enjoy the show, please leave a review for me, either on iTunes or Stitcher or any place where leaving a review is possible. The whole click 1 to 5-star thing is always appreciated, but if you can write a few words about me, like a sentence or two about how much you enjoy the show, people do read those reviews, and perhaps I'll get a new fan from somebody saying, you know what, this podcast, it's pretty sweet. You should check it out. That would be greatly appreciated. Do you enjoy What Magic Is This and you feel like you want to support the show? Well, now you can. I have a Patreon account. It is only $7 a month, and it gives you access to a whole bunch of great features, things like access to a Discord server where it's myself and a bunch of other operant magicians. I even have former guests on there to talk to. If you have any questions about any episode, you can fling it there and maybe somebody will get back to you. But it's a wonderful community. Also on my Patreon, I try to do full episodes. I do whole episodes about things that the Patreon patrons want me to talk about, from my own magical practice to new rituals to my favorite books or books that I think are important to magic, to Goetia and grimoires, to figures and deities and all of this great stuff. I do full-length episodes. I also do videos. I literally just finished shooting a video that's about half an hour long. I go out of my way to make this content a ton of fun for my patrons, and I actually think that my best work is my Patreon content. And I know that sounds like I'm trying to give you a pitch, but my Patreon is where I get to flex my creativity and my weird muscles to put out content that I really, really love. And it gets a bit more personal. So if you enjoy the main podcast, let me tell you, you'll love the Patreon content. As I said, $7 a month, that is all I'm asking for. I only have one tier, so it's either you support the show or you do not. There it is. That's my pitch. Head to patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com. There's tons of Patreon links there. If you're not a fan of the whole $7 a month thing, but you still want to support the show, well, there's a couple ways of doing that. One is PayPal. I have PayPal me links all over whatmagicisthis.com. Click one of those and you can donate $5, $10, $20, $2,000, any and all amount helps. It goes right back into making this podcast. It's for the hosting of the website or the podcast hosting. This stuff isn't cheap. It's not cheap at all. So any amount of money that you donate through the PayPal, it goes right back into the show. Another way of supporting me and also kind of being part of my marketing team is that I now have a fully comprehensive merch store. If you want t-shirts, stickers, phone cases, tote bags, hoodies, fridge magnets, pins, and way more, head to whatmagicisthis.com, click on merchandise, and you can get any and all of those. I have about 6 designs up, and they're absolutely great. People are loving the shirts. They're arriving in record time. I'm actually quite surprised. I ordered a couple of t-shirts for myself and they arrived 3 days later. It was kind of crazy, but if you want to show your support for the show as well as a little bit of financial support by buying a t-shirt or a mug or something like that, then head to whatmagicisthis.com and head to the merch store there. It allows you to show off how much you love the greatest occult podcast of all time, right? Right. But all I'm saying, it would be wonderful if you could support the show. This is literally my job. It's what I do. I don't do anything else for work. This podcast is it. So if you could see your way to helping out in any way possible, that would be greatly appreciated. I have enough listeners every month to apply for advertising. I would hate to have to put advertising up on this podcast. I think it would be awful. I know that there's some podcasts out there that would love to be able to advertise. I think it would ruin everything. I think it would be awful. So I truly rely on support from the people that love this podcast, whether that be through Patreon or PayPal or even just buying some merch. It all helps. Suffice to say that any and all of this is available at whatmagicisthis.com. So I hope that everybody enjoyed these beastly thoughts of mine, and this concludes the month of the beast. I hope some of you learned some things. I hope that each and every one of you came away with some kind of new perspective, and I hope that I pissed some people off, because it's what Crowley would have wanted. All right, that's the show, everybody. Back to regular scheduled programming in the next 10 days or so. Until then, I want you all to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We will talk at you soon. Goodbye, everybody. Bye-bye.